Have you ever wondered what makes someone the patriarch of a great and mighty nation? The story of Abraham begins with a promise from God, a promise that would change the course of human history. God said, "Leave your homeland and go to the land I will show you." Are you willing to walk in faith, even when you don't know where it will lead you? Join us as we explore the journey of the chosen one, from Ur to the Promised Land. God promised Abraham vast lands and a multitude of descendants. Abraham built an altar to offer sacrifices and pledged his unwavering loyalty to God. God said that Abraham would have a son, and his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Abraham made a covenant with God, pledging his loyalty and offering all that he had. God protected Abraham and his family from hostile forces, blessing them with safety and guidance at every step. Abraham and Lot parted ways peacefully, each taking a different path to avoid conflict. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, and his name would be honored forever. Abraham named his son Isaac, as God had commanded, and prepared to fulfill the great covenant. God tested Abraham by asking him to sacrifice Isaac, but intervened at the last moment. God promised that Abraham's descendants would become a great nation and be blessed. Abraham returned home after completing his mission, knowing he had fulfilled his promise to God. In his later years, Abraham looked back on his journey and saw that God had fulfilled all his promises. The legacy of Abraham lives on, with his descendants continuing to live by faith and the promises of God. Do you believe that faith can transform the future of an entire nation? God said, "Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky." God promised that Abraham's descendants would become as numerous as the stars in the sky. Abraham thanked God for the promise of numerous descendants. God promised to give Abraham's descendants a vast and beautiful land. God said, "I have given you this land, from the Nile to the Euphrates." Abraham dreamed of his descendants growing and prospering in the Promised Land. Abraham built an altar and offered a sacrifice to God in gratitude. Abraham's descendants will live in peace and prosperity in the land God has promised. God made a covenant with Abraham, promising that his descendants would inherit the Promised Land. God reaffirmed his promise of land and descendants to Abraham. Abraham's descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, beyond count. Abraham thanked God for the covenant of land and descendants. God promised that Abraham's descendants would prosper and multiply in the future. Abraham dreamed of his descendants spreading and prospering across the Promised Land. God promised that Abraham's descendants would be numerous and live in harmony. The Promised Land will become fertile and prosperous for Abraham's descendants. Abraham saw in a dream his descendants growing strong and prosperous in the Promised Land. God will protect Abraham's descendants in all circumstances. Abraham dreamed of his descendants being blessed and protected by God. God established his covenant with Abraham, reaffirming the promise of land and descendants. Have you ever looked up at the sky and wondered, what is God's plan for your life? God's covenant with Abraham, Genesis 17. God said, "I will establish my covenant with you and your descendants after you 4 generations to come." Abraham received a new name, marking his role as the father of many nations. Abraham bowed in reverence and gratitude before God for the everlasting covenant. God said, "Every male among you shall be circumcised as a sign of the covenant." Abraham performed circumcision on himself and all the males in his household as commanded by God. God said, "Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac." Sarah, in surprise, listened to the promise that she would bear a son. Abraham thanked God for the promise of Isaac, who would inherit the covenant. Abraham's family rejoiced in the promise of a prosperous lineage from God. God reminded Abraham, "Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore." Abraham prayed, thanking God for the covenant and the promise of numerous descendants. Abraham and Sarah trusted in God's eternal covenant, looking to the future with hope. The Promised Land will be a place where Abraham's descendants will prosper and live in peace. God confirmed, this covenant will be maintained from generation to generation. Abraham thanked God for the covenant and the promise of numerous descendants. God said, "My covenant with you and your descendants will last forever." In a dream, Abraham saw his descendants thriving and numerous as promised by God. Abraham's descendants will spread out and prosper, just as God promised. Abraham and Sarah prepared to welcome Isaac, the heir to God's covenant. God said, "Sarah will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac." What do you think about Abraham's faith in God's promise? Promise fulfilled. God's promise was fulfilled when Sarah gave birth to Isaac. But God continued to test Abraham's faith with a difficult request. Abraham, with absolute trust in God, prepares to offer his beloved son. Isaac, unaware of what is to come, trusts in his father and God. God intervened just in time, sending an angel to stop Abraham. The angel said, "God has seen your faithfulness and does not require you to sacrifice your son." God provided a ram to take Isaac's place as the sacrifice. Abraham offered the ram on the altar, thanking God for his mercy and protection. Abraham and Isaac knelt before the altar, offering prayers of thanks to God. God said to Abraham, "Because you did not withhold your son, your descendants will be blessed." Abraham's descendants will become numerous and prosperous, just as God promised. Abraham and Isaac returned home with stronger faith and joy in their hearts. Abraham's family lived in God's blessing and peace. God affirmed, "This covenant will be maintained forever, from generation to generation." Isaac, now grown, looked up at the starry sky, remembering God's promise to his father. God's covenant continued through the generations, bringing blessings to Abraham's descendants. Abraham looked at his descendants with pride, knowing that God's promise had been fulfilled. God's promise was fulfilled, bringing peace and prosperity to Abraham's descendants. Abraham thanked God for keeping his promise and establishing his covenant with his descendants. God intervenes, saves Isaac, and confirms Abraham's absolute faith. Have you ever faced a major challenge in your life? Share your story. Promise comes true. Genesis 1:7. The Promised Land is passed down from generation to generation, as God had spoken. Abraham's descendants live in harmony and prosperity on the land God promised them. Isaac passes down God's covenant with Abraham to the next generation. The Promised Land becomes fertile and abundant, sustaining Abraham's descendants. Abraham gives thanks to God for the blessings bestowed upon his descendants. God's covenant with Abraham will endure through the generations, as countless as the stars in the sky. Abraham and Isaac know that their descendants will live in blessing and prosperity forever. Abraham's family lives in harmony, passing down their faith and God's covenant together. God's promise is not just for Abraham, but for every generation that follows. Isaac prepares to pass down God's promise and covenant to his son, continuing Abraham's legacy. Abraham's family tree continues to grow, with each generation carrying God's promise. Abraham gazes upon his family with contentment, knowing God's promise has been fulfilled. God's promise has come to pass, bringing peace and blessings to Abraham's descendants. Abraham's family prays together, giving thanks to God for keeping his promise. Van Ben MCC Hun. God has blessed Abraham's descendants with prosperity, bringing them abundance. Abraham and Isaac look to the future together, trusting in God's continued presence. Abraham's descendants live in peace and happiness, as God had promised. Abraham departs in peace, knowing that God's promise has been fulfilled. The legacy of Abraham spun through the generations, and God's promise remains. Abraham's faith, obedience, and trust in God built a great nation. The tree of Abraham's lineage continues to grow, each branch representing a new generation. Abraham's descendants continue to pray and honor God through the generations. Peace and stability prevail in Abraham's descendants, under God's protection. Faith and covenant with God are the firm foundation for Abraham's descendants. Abraham's legacy is more than land, it is faith and obedience to God. The younger generations carry on Abraham's legacy, building a prosperous and enduring future. The family of Abraham prays together, steadfast in their faith in God. The Promised Land, where Abraham's descendants live, has become beautiful and fruitful under God's care. God's covenant with Abraham is eternal, never to be broken. The descendants of Abraham shine bright like the stars, protected by God. The children of Abraham's lineage continue to live in blessings and peace. The elders of Abraham's lineage gather in prayer, upholding tradition and faith. As night falls, the stars begin to shine, reminding us of God's covenant with Abraham. Prosperity and blessings are ever present in the lives of Abraham's descendants. Abraham's descendants continue to grow and expand, ever moving forward under God's protection. The family of Abraham, from the Patriarch to the future generations, shares in the faith and blessings of God. God's light shines down, symbolizing his eternal promise and protection over Abraham's descendants. Hai hung kn, the BT tune, Theng bao ji can be en el nung kao chian gc tin, agi yakuk. Chia sp video na nuban cm the ggc kitchel.